What made a golden Labrador refuse to eat, sleep, or even blink unless it was watching over a shivering silver tabby kitten? The dog wasn't just being protective. He was holding onto a secret only animals seem to understand. And when a vet finally uncovered the truth, it led them deep into the woods and into the heart of a chilling mystery involving a missing child. Whiskey's Vigil, the dog who wouldn't let go. As we begin this story, we'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Feel free to share if you'd like. Ash Hollow was a quiet town tucked beneath the pine-covered hills of Montana. Nothing ever happened here until the morning Dr. Grace Whitaker found a half-frozen kitten on her clinic doorstep, and her Labrador Whiskey refused to leave its side. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just watched. And that's when Grace knew this wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The town of Ash Hollow still slumbered under a veil of mist when Dr. Grace Whitaker arrived at her clinic that morning. The autumn chill clung to the ground like an old secret, curling around the faded wooden sign that read, "Whitaker Veterinary Care. Compassion First." Nestled in a valley of golden aspens and ponderosa pines in western Montana, Ash Hollow wasn't the sort of place that made headlines. It was quiet, dependable, a place where everyone left their doors unlocked and still waved to the mail carrier as if it were 1952. But that morning, something was different. The kind of different that made the hairs rise on the back of your neck before your mind could catch up. Grace was 38, with a calm, grounded presence that came from both training and temperament. She was tall, with dark auburn hair usually tied back in a loose bun, and pale green eyes that had seen enough suffering to notice the smallest shift in behavior, animal or human. She carried the kind of sorrow people didn't always see but always felt. Years ago, she'd lost her younger brother in a hiking accident, a wound that quietly shaped the way she cared for the most fragile lives in Ash Hollow. She was known for staying late with sick animals, skipping lunch to comfort grieving pet owners, and sitting on the floor beside frightened dogs until they stopped shaking. That morning, she was barely halfway through unlocking the clinic door when she saw a faded dish towel folded into a loose bundle resting on the bench by the entrance. The towel was damp from the fog, and something inside it moved barely. Her heart picked up pace. Kneeling slowly, Grace peeled back the edge of the cloth, revealing a small silver tabby kitten curled into itself, its tiny body trembling from cold and fear. Its fur was short and matted, streaked with dust and dried sap, with the signature pattern of an American Shorthair, silvery stripes swirling like smoke across a dull gray coat. It couldn't have been more than 7 weeks old. One eye was half shut with crusted discharge, and its breathing came in shallow puffs. It didn't meow. It didn't move. Grace lifted the kitten gently, cradling it against her chest as she pushed open the clinic door and stepped inside. The warmth of the building hit her immediately, followed by the familiar scent of antiseptic, fresh hay, and the faint citrus of the orange peel cleaner she used. She moved quickly, flipping on the overhead lights and heading to the examination table. The kitten barely stirred when she placed it on a towel-lined pad. As she reached for her stethoscope, she heard a soft shuffle behind her. Turning, she saw Whiskey. Whiskey was a Labrador retriever, 5 years old, with a thick, creamy golden coat that always looked freshly brushed, even when it wasn't. His eyes were the kind of deep amber that held questions rather than answers. He'd come to her 2 months earlier after suffering a torn tendon during a volunteer search and rescue mission in the mountains. Whiskey wasn't just any dog. He'd been trained for disaster response, capable of sniffing out survivors beneath rubble and snow. But what made Whiskey special wasn't his skill, it was his heart. He had a gentleness that made frightened children reach for him before their parents, a kind of soulfulness that made him seem like he was listening to more than just sounds, like he was listening to you. Whiskey should have been asleep in his kennel. His post-surgery confinement was critical to recovery. Yet there he stood in the hallway, silent and perfectly still. His gaze was fixed on the kitten. "Whiskey?" Grace called softly, but he didn't budge. He walked forward slowly, not towards her, but toward the table. He sat beside it, eyes locked on the small bundle of fur. And there he stayed. Grace placed a hand on his back. He didn't flinch, but she felt the tension under his fur. He was alert, completely focused, not curious, not confused, guarding. It was a strange moment, and Grace wasn't one to jump to conclusions. Animals had instincts, yes, but Whiskey's behavior went beyond instinct. It was intentional, measured. She tried coaxing him away with a biscuit. Nothing. She rattled his food dish. He didn't even flick an ear. Only when she moved toward the kitten again did his eyes flick to her hand, as if to make sure she wasn't going to hurt it. "I'm just helping, boy," she whispered, more to herself than him. She continued her initial assessment. The kitten's temperature was dangerously low. There were faint bruises around its hind legs, not the kind caused by a fall, but more like someone had gripped it. Not forcefully enough to break bones, but enough to leave a message. No collar, no microchip, just a broken creature delivered in silence to her doorstep. The bell over the front door jingled. Grace looked up to see a woman enter, breathless, holding a clipboard. She was thin, in her early 50s, with wiry gray blonde hair tucked beneath a wool cap. Her uniform marked her as a postal worker. "Sorry," the woman said, clutching the clipboard like a lifeline. "I left that little one outside. Found her by the old grain mill on Juniper Road." Grace gave a nod. "Thank you. What's your name?" "Celia Robbins," she replied. "I just couldn't leave it there. Poor thing was crying. Then it just stopped. I thought it was gone." "Almost was," Grace murmured. She handed Celia a found animal intake form, noting how the woman's hands shook slightly as she filled it out. Celia left quickly after that, muttering something about finishing her route. As the door closed, Grace glanced back at Whiskey. He hadn't moved an inch. She whispered, "What do you know that I don't?" Whiskey blinked slowly and resumed his vigil. By the following morning, the fog had lifted over Ash Hollow, revealing a brittle layer of frost coating the clinic's front steps. The golden aspens rustled faintly in the breeze as the sun climbed, but inside Whitaker Veterinary Care, the air remained unusually still. The usual hum of a waking facility, the clink of food bowls, the shuffle of paws, the quiet murmur of Grace's voice greeting her patients, was replaced by something quieter, heavier. Whiskey hadn't moved from his place beside the kitten's enclosure. Dr. Grace Whitaker had expected him to lose interest, at least long enough to eat. But when she placed his breakfast down his usual kibble mixed with a spoonful of warm chicken broth, barely glanced at it. His amber eyes remained fixed on the small figure curled in the corner of the incubator, now lined with fleece blankets and warmed by a soft heat lamp. Marble, as Grace had quietly started calling her, was still barely responsive. The name came to her instinctively the night before, after she'd cleaned the dust from the kitten's coat and revealed the soft sheen of silver and gray beneath, like weather-worn stone, veined and delicate. A fragile thing built to endure. Grace crouched beside Whiskey, gently pressing her hand into his thick fur. "You've got to eat, boy," she said softly. "You're not helping anyone if you collapse on me." Whiskey leaned against her hand briefly, then returned to his vigil. His body was tense, not in fear, but in focus. His tail lay still against the floor, and even his breathing had a hush to it, as if he were afraid of startling the kitten. Grace rose and crossed the room to check Marble's vitals again. Temperature was holding steady. Hydration had improved slightly. But it was Marble's behavior that kept Grace up the night before, not the silence, but the detachment. Marble wasn't simply scared. She was absent. Even in the presence of a gentle human touch, she didn't respond the way most rescues did. No flinching, no attempts to escape, but no seeking of comfort either. She allowed herself to be handled with the kind of limpness Grace recognized from the worst cases, trauma, the kind born from abandonment, not accident. As she adjusted the lamp, she felt a familiar buzz in her coat pocket. Her phone. She pulled it out and saw a text from her receptionist, Molly Dean. Running late. Tire blew out on 89. Be there in 30. Molly was 24, friendly and meticulous, with an athletic build and a freckled face framed by blunt-cut dark hair. She'd moved to Ash Hollow a year ago from Bozeman after leaving a degree in pre-med behind. Too many people, she often said. I like animals better. Grace had never asked why she'd left school, but she sensed something painful behind it, and she never pressed. Looks like it's just us this morning, Grace muttered, glancing at Whiskey. A soft mule stopped her. It came from Marble. Grace turned quickly. The kitten had shifted ever so slightly, lifting her head to look not at Grace, but at Whiskey. Her large blue eyes, glassy with exhaustion, locked with the Labrador's warm amber gaze. It wasn't fear she showed. It was recognition. Grace blinked. Marble let out another soft, raspy cry and placed one tiny paw against the glass panel of the incubator wall. Whiskey inched closer and touched his nose to the glass in return. The air in the room changed. Grace's heart thudded, not from fear, but from knowing. Whatever had happened to Marble hadn't just left her. Broken it had left her needing him. Not any dog. Not just warmth. Whiskey. The vet's eyes flicked to the clock. She had 3 routine appointments that morning, but this wasn't routine. She needed answers. And there was someone who might be able to provide them. Grace walked to the intake form, still clipped to the front desk. The handwriting was rushed, uneven. Celia Robbins, the postal worker. She'd said she'd found the kitten near the old grain mill on Juniper Road. Grace knew that area well abandoned for years, surrounded by chain-link fence and whispering pine trees. But something about Celia's manner had stuck with her. Not the simple nervousness of someone shaken by an animal in need. No. There was a tension beneath her words, a hesitation when Grace had asked follow-up questions, and she'd left too quickly, as if afraid of what Grace might ask next. Grace pulled her phone again and called the local post office. "Morning. This is Ash Hollow Postal," said a gruff male voice. Jack speaking. "Hi, Jack. This is Dr. Grace Whitaker, over at the vet clinic. I was wondering if Celia Robbins is working today." A pause. "She called out sick this morning. First time in, heck, I don't know, years." Grace's fingers tightened around the phone. "Did she say why?" "Said she was feeling off. That's all I got. Everything okay?" "Yeah, thanks, Jack," Grace replied, already lost in thought. She hung up and walked slowly back toward the enclosure. Marble was asleep again, curled tighter now, but Whiskey remained right where he was, eyes steady, his breath fogging the glass in rhythmic intervals. Grace knelt beside him, resting her hand over his heart. "What happened out there?" she whispered. "What did she see?" Whiskey said nothing, but his silence was louder than words. The clinic was quiet again by late afternoon. Most of the morning's appointments had come and gone: an aging border collie with arthritis, a pair of energetic tabby siblings in for vaccinations, and a rabbit with overgrown teeth. But Grace's thoughts had barely left the enclosure where Marble now lay resting. Every hour or so, she checked on the kitten, noting the slow but visible signs of recovery, slightly better breathing, a few small sips of water, and now, a tendency to shift toward the side of the enclosure nearest Whiskey. The Labrador, ever faithful, had only stood to stretch or circle once or twice before resuming his vigil. Molly Dean had finally arrived around 11 a.m., a streak of road dust across her jeans and dark smudges on her hands from wrestling with the blown tire. "Should have taken my dad's truck," she muttered with a sheepish grin. Her presence brought a bit of normalcy to the clinic, but even she noticed something off. As she walked past the enclosure, she paused. "That's the kitten from yesterday?" she asked, peering in. "Her name's Marble," Grace said absently. "I'm not sure why, but it fits." Molly nodded. "She looks like something delicate that's been through hell." Grace said nothing. She was thinking about Celia Robbins, about the call to the post office, and about the tension that had seemed to follow the woman like a shadow. Around 4 p.m., Grace retreated into her office with a cup of too bitter coffee and her laptop. Paperwork loomed, but her mind wandered. She pulled up the local news site, thinking perhaps she'd check weather alerts or maybe see if Celia had mentioned anything online. Instead, the headline stopped her cold. Family still searching for missing girl. Public asked for any leads. Her heart dropped. The article had been posted an hour earlier. Clicking through, she found a photo of a young girl with light blonde hair and a bright blue headband, no older than 6 or 7. Her name was Lily Chapman. She had gone missing 3 days ago near the west ridge of Ash Hollow, not far from the abandoned grain mill, the same area where Celia claimed she found Marble. The photo showed Lily smiling shyly, one hand clutching the strap of a small green backpack. Grace froze as her eyes moved down the article. Last seen wearing an orange hoodie with white stripes on the sleeves. A familiar color. Her mind flashed back to Marble's fur the morning before, how she had pulled out a small piece of fuzz caught in the kitten's hindquarters. She remembered thinking it looked like part of a fabric, soft and synthetic, but she hadn't had time to examine it further. She didn't want to jump to conclusions. She also knew, after 15 years in this profession, that animals often picked up traces of their environments, dirt, leaves, blood, and sometimes things they weren't supposed to. Grace turned the laptop toward Whiskey, who still sat outside Marble's enclosure. "I wonder if you recognize her," she whispered. Then, as if on cue, Whiskey lifted his head. The screen showed Lily's picture again, the bright headband a small splash of innocence against the otherwise gray article. Whiskey whined. It wasn't a bark or a whimper. It was low, mournful, filled with a depth of feeling Grace had only heard from him once after a rescue mission had failed during a landslide response the year before. "Whiskey," Grace murmured, heart tightening. "You know her, don't you?" Whiskey stood, walked to the edge of the desk, and placed his front paws gently against it. His amber eyes stared at the screen, ears pricked, body trembling just slightly. Then, without warning, he barked once, sharp, urgent. Molly rushed in from the hallway. "Is everything okay?" Grace stood. Her mind was already racing. "Do you remember that fuzzy bit I pulled from Marble's leg?" Molly frowned. "Yeah, I think you dropped it near the sink." Grace was already moving. She found it wedged under a paper towel dispenser, a small tangle of orange fiber, threaded with white. She held it up to the light. It wasn't fur, it was fleece. The color was nearly identical to the one in the photo. "Call Officer Riley," she said, her voice more solid than it felt. "Tell him I need to report a possible link to the Chapman case. Don't tell anyone else yet. Not until we're sure." Molly blinked. "You think the kitten's connected to Lily?" "I think Marble didn't just wander out of the woods," Grace said, staring into the enclosure. "I think she came from somewhere, and I think Whiskey's been trying to tell us from the start." Outside, the last of the daylight slipped behind the distant ridgeline, casting the trees in long, slanted shadows. Inside the clinic, Marble stirred slightly, curling a little closer to the glass. Whiskey sat again, watching, waiting, not just for Marble now, but maybe, just maybe, for her. The next morning arrived brittle and cold, the kind of chill that crept into the corners of windows and clung to the seams of sweaters. Inside Whitaker Veterinary Care, the heating lamps hummed softly, casting a golden glow across the treatment room. Marble lay curled in the corner of her enclosure, her silver tabby coat faintly glistening under the light. She hadn't eaten much overnight, but she was stable, and that gave Grace hope. Grace rolled up her sleeves, her fingers still stiff from the cold. She planned to clean Marble more thoroughly that morning, now that the kitten had warmed and was less likely to go into shock. She gathered a soft bristled brush, a bowl of warm water, and a towel. Whiskey, as always, watched her every move from his station beside the enclosure. "Ready, boy?" she said, half smiling as she unlocked the incubator door. Whiskey's ears perked slightly, but he didn't rise. Grace lifted Marble gently. The kitten gave a soft, tired chirp but didn't resist. She laid her on the towel and began carefully brushing through the tiny body starting at the shoulders, working along the spine. Tangled debris fell away with each stroke, bits of pine needles, dirt, some old cobwebs. It wasn't until she reached the area near Marble's left hind leg that she paused. There, tangled deep in the soft fur beneath the thigh, was a thread. Not fur, not grass, a distinct, synthetic strand, bright orange. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She set the brush aside and reached for her tweezers, carefully pulling the fiber free and holding it up to the light. It was slightly curled, as if twisted through movement, and glinted with the sheen of fleece. A piece of fabric, unmistakably torn from something worn. She placed it into a sterile evidence bag and sealed it. "Orange," she whispered, "just like the hoodie." Whiskey stood. He moved toward her slowly, not out of curiosity but in response to something deeper. His eyes flicked between Grace and the kitten, then to the sealed bag on the counter. Then he let out a low, quiet growl. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even aggressive. It was alert. A second later, the clinic's bell above the front door jingled. Grace turned, startled. It was too early for walk-ins. Molly, who'd been prepping the front desk for the day, appeared in the doorway behind the reception counter. Her expression was pinched. "Grace," she called quietly, "there's someone here to see you." Grace wrapped Marble gently and placed her back in the enclosure before walking out into the lobby. A tall man stood near the door, rubbing his hands together as if trying to shake off the cold. He was in his late 30s, with a trim beard and a dark denim jacket that looked worn at the elbows. His jeans were dusty, boots scuffed with pine tar. His name tag marked him as a state parks employee. "Morning, ma'am," he said, voice low but polite. "Sorry to just drop in. I'm Thomas Chapman." The name hit Grace like a jolt. Lily's father. Up close, Thomas Chapman looked like a man unraveling thread by thread. His blue eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, and deep lines carved around his mouth told of long days without sleep. His posture was stiff, guarded, as if he no longer trusted his own frame to hold up. "I heard from Officer Riley that you had something possibly connected to my daughter." Grace gestured toward the back. "Come with me." She led him into the examination room, where Marble rested and Whiskey stood once more in silent watch. As soon as they entered, Whiskey let out a bark, short, loud, directly at Thomas. Thomas recoiled, startled. "Is he? Does he bite?" "Not unless you're made of cheese," Grace said quickly, placing a hand on Whiskey's back. "Sorry, he's just been protective." Thomas took a cautious step forward. "Is that the kitten?" "Yes," Grace said, lifting the bagged orange fiber. "I found this in her fur. It looks like fleece. I know your daughter was reported wearing an orange hoodie," he finished, voice cracked and thin. "Yeah, she never took it off." He stared at Marble for a long moment. The kitten shifted, eyes fluttering half open. Then, slowly, she extended her front paw toward the glass. Grace and Thomas both froze. "She's not scared of him," Thomas said softly, pointing to Whiskey. "That dog." "No," Grace murmured. "She never has been." Thomas exhaled. It wasn't relief, more like resignation. "That place, the old grain mill. I told her not to go near there. It's dangerous. There's a network of old ventilation tunnels under it. You could fall right through the floorboards." "Do you think she was there?" Grace asked. He shook his head slowly. "She'd never go alone, but she had a thing for animals. She used to leave out tuna cans for the strays, said they needed her." Grace felt a chill deeper than the weather could explain. She glanced at Marble, at Whiskey, then back to Thomas. "She might not have been alone," she said. He turned sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, holding the evidence bag between them, We might not be looking at a simple disappearance anymore, and I think this kitten is trying to lead us somewhere." Thomas looked as though she had slapped him. His jaw tightened, but then his shoulders slumped. "I just want her back," he said hoarsely. "Even if it's just to say goodbye." "No," Grace said gently. "Not goodbye. Not yet." The morning sky was a dull pewter gray, swollen with the promise of snow. A biting wind swept down from the hills and rattled the windows of Whitaker Veterinary Care, as if nature itself were impatient for something to break. Inside, Grace moved with purpose, though her thoughts spiraled in quiet turbulence. The orange fleece fiber was now sealed and logged, ready for the police. Whiskey was calm but unusually alert, watching the door as if he expected something or someone to walk through it. Grace's instincts, sharpened by years of reading both animals and humans, kept returning to one person, Celia Robbins, the postal worker who had delivered marble that first morning. Only now, Grace knew she'd gotten the name wrong. The woman who had dropped off the kitten wasn't Celia. Grace had double-checked the postal route roster through Officer Riley Grant. Celia had been on medical leave the entire week. The woman who brought marble had signed Celia on the form, but there was no Celia working that route anymore. That meant one thing: the woman had lied, and Grace had a strong suspicion who it really was. Her name was Cora Dempsey, a substitute mail carrier who occasionally filled in on the outer routes around Ash Hollow. Grace didn't know her well just enough to recall a woman in her early 50s with a heavy frame, wiry salt and pepper hair usually pinned back in a hasty bun, and an anxious air that clung to her like static. She wasn't known for conversation, but townsfolk remembered her as polite and timid, someone who kept her eyes low and her voice soft. That timidity now felt like a mask. Around 10 o'clock, just as Molly stepped out to pick up restock supplies from the feed store, the bell above the clinic door jingled. Grace was in the back, reviewing Marble's hydration notes, when Whiskey shot upright from his spot by the glass. His ears pinned forward, and his stance stiffened. He let out a single, sharp bark that echoed through the exam room. Grace walked out front, and there she was. Cora Dempsey stood just inside the doorway, hands twisted around the strap of her canvas mailbag. Her eyes darted around the room like a trapped bird. She wore the same navy uniform jacket and black cap from the first day, but now her expression was pale, lips tight, as if she were fighting something inside herself. "Morning," Grace said calmly. "You're not on today's schedule." "Two was on my way through town," Cora stammered. "Thought I'd check on the kitten. Is she still here?" Whiskey growled, low, steady. Grace didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped aside and gestured toward the back room. "We can talk in private." Cora hesitated, her fingers twitching. "I won't stay long. Just thought I should see if she's healthy," Grace finished for her. "Or if she's told me something." That stopped Cora in her tracks. Her face twitched, just briefly, before she forced a tight smile. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Let's talk," Grace said, her voice firmer now. They entered the examination room where Marble dozed in her heated enclosure. Whiskey stayed close, positioning himself between Cora and the kitten. His growl never stopped. Grace leaned against the counter and folded her arms. "I spoke with the postmaster," she said. "Celia's been out all week. You're not Celia. You signed the name on the report." Cora flinched, her mouth opening, then closing again. "Why did you lie, Cora?" "Two, didn't think it mattered," she said quickly. "The kitten was hurt. I just wanted to do the right thing." "You said you found her near the old grain mill," Grace pressed. "Was that true?" "Yes." Cora replied too fast, too eagerly. "Behind the fence, near the road." Grace watched her closely. "Or was it behind the building? Maybe near the loading dock?" "That's what you said the first time, wasn't it?" Cora blinked rapidly. "Well, I might have said the road, but it was near the dumpsters, I think." Grace stepped closer. "You know there's a child missing. Lily Chapman. We found orange fleece in the kitten's fur." fleece that matches what Lily was last seen wearing. Cora's face turned ashen. "I didn't see a girl," she said too quickly. "I didn't ask if you did." Cora gripped the strap of her bag so tightly her knuckles went white. I saw someone near the mill. A man, tall, wearing a hood. I thought it was nothing, probably a hiker or something." "When was this?" Cora hesitated. 3 days ago. Same day Lily went missing." "I didn't know it was connected," she blurted out. "I didn't. I was scared. I thought if I told someone, they'd think I made it up." Whiskey barked suddenly, loud, deep, protective. Cora staggered back a step, pressing herself against the wall. "I didn't do anything wrong," she cried. "I didn't hurt anyone, I swear." "I didn't say you did," Grace said, voice cold and sharp as ice. "But you're withholding information in a missing child case. That is wrong." Tears welled in Cora's eyes now. "I just saw the kitten, scratching at the vent by the side wall, crying. I thought if I brought her here, maybe someone would connect the dots, but I couldn't be the one to say it." "You are the one to say it now," Grace replied, stepping aside. "You need to go to the sheriff. Right now." Cora stood there, trembling, eyes wide like a deer caught in headlights. Then, without another word, she bolted. The clinic door slammed behind her. Whiskey stayed at the exam room threshold, ears rigid, tail unmoving. Grace exhaled slowly and whispered, "She knows something, maybe everything." By the time the sun began slipping behind the ragged ridgelines of Ash Hollow, the wind had shifted, carrying with it the metallic scent of snow in the distance. A quiet pressure settled over the valley of stillness that made even the squirrels pause mid-scurry. Inside the clinic, Grace finished logging her notes, her movements quick but distracted. She kept glancing toward Whiskey, who stood near the front door, unusually restless. He'd been pacing all afternoon, ears twitching at sounds Grace couldn't hear, nose lifted often as if trying to catch something on the wind. And then, just after 5 o'clock, he sat in front of the door and looked back at her with an intensity she couldn't ignore. "You want to go," she said softly. "Don't you?" Whiskey responded with a low, insistent whine and a shift of his paws. Grace glanced at Marble, who was asleep in her enclosure, curled tightly into a pale comma of fur. Molly had offered to stay with her for the evening. Grace called out, and a moment later, Molly appeared, coat already half on. "You heading out?" "Only if you can watch Marble for a while longer," Grace replied. "Whiskey's asking for something. I need to follow him." Molly's expression turned serious. "You think he knows something?" "I think he knows exactly where to go." Grace grabbed her coat from the hook, stuffed a flashlight and small first aid kit into her bag, and clipped Whiskey's leash onto his collar. She didn't expect to use Ith was leading, not following. They drove out of town in Grace's old pickup, the heater rattling and the headlights cutting through the oncoming dusk. Whiskey sat in the passenger seat, body taut, head turned toward the window, watching the trees blur past. He stirred when they passed the trailhead to Hollow Creek, but didn't bark. Instead, he sat forward, tail swishing once, and let out a sharp sound when Grace slowed near the old ranger station abandoned years ago, when the fire watch had been relocated to a newer facility farther up the mountain. She parked just off the access road. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the pines, casting shadows that danced across the dirt. The air here was colder, sharper. Whiskey leapt from the truck the moment the door opened, nose immediately to the ground, moving with clear intent. Grace followed him past the decaying structure of the old station, a one-room wooden cabin, with its windows boarded up and moss growing thick across the roofline. A rusted water barrel tipped sideways near the rear. Whiskey didn't pause. He trotted toward the tree line, tail straight, body low to the ground. Grace clicked on her flashlight, the beam piercing between tree trunks, draped in heavy cloaks of pine needles. The ground here was soft, covered in years of fallen brush, but even so, she saw it. A small smear of something dark against the pale root of an overturned log. Blood. Dried, brown at the edges, but unmistakably blood. Her breath caught. Whiskey circled the spot once, sniffed deeply, then let out a whimper. He moved on quickly, his paws silent as he followed an invisible trail. Grace scrambled to keep up, heart pounding. After about 50 feet, he stopped again, this time at a patch of disturbed soil. Embedded in the dirt were small indentations, faint, but clearly the shape of shoes child-sized. The pattern of the tread uneven. A child had come this way. "Lily," Grace whispered, kneeling beside the print. Whiskey let out a short bark and bounded forward, darting between two leaning trees and into a hollowed-out depression in the forest floor. Grace followed and found herself staring at a large, partially rusted ventilation shaft, its opening framed in old concrete. The grate that once covered it had been wrenched aside. Torn vines dangled from the mouth like hair. The hole was wide enough for a small childer, a desperate animalto, crawl through. Whiskey sniffed the edge, growled low, then turned to Grace. His eyes were wide, filled not with fear but urgency. Grace dropped to one knee, aimed her flashlight into the dark opening. The beam hit only swirling dust and a steep, narrow tunnel lined with metal ribs and broken insulation. Somewhere inside, she thought she heard something, a faint shuffle. Maybe an echo, maybe wishful thinking. She pulled out her phone. No signal. Of course not. She pulled back and looked at Whiskey. "You brought me here for a reason," she said quietly. "I need to let Riley know." She marked the trees with 2 quick slashes from her pocket knife, then led Whiskey back toward the truck. She didn't need a map. She had the dog who never stopped watching. The air around the old ventilation shaft had grown colder, tinged with the scent of rust, damp earth, and something older stale, sealed away time. Grace stood frozen at the edge of the opening, flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. Beside her, Whiskey's whole body had gone rigid, his head lowered, ears pinned, as he stared into the dark mouth of the tunnel. Then he let out a frantic bark, sharp, desperate, and louder than any she'd heard from him before. "Easy, boy," Grace whispered, placing a hand on his neck, but he jerked forward, pulling at the leash like he meant to throw himself inside. She crouched low, aiming her flashlight into the shaft again. The beam struggled to cut through the dust-heavy air, revealing only twisted insulation and metal ribs clinging to the inside like exposed bone. For a long second, there was nothing but the hum of wind through the pines. Then, a sound. Faint. A soft, tremulous whimper. Not from an animal. From a child. "Lily," Grace breathed. She dropped to her knees and shoved her shoulder bag off, pulling out a portable headlamp and strapping it over her knit cap. She clicked it on and glanced once more at Whiskey. "Stay here," she said, though she knew he wouldn't. Grace eased herself into the opening, boots scraping against metal. The shaft sloped steeply for the first several feet before leveling out into a tight crawl space. The cold was immediate, like a cave, stealing warmth from her hands. The silence closed around her in thick folds, then broke again with another soft moan, closer this time. She moved fast, elbows scraping the sides, knees pushing through dirt and fragments of rusted debris. The light from her headlamp caught the shimmer of moisture on the walls, and then, tucked just beyond a bend in the shaft, a small form, lying on its side, curled into itself. Blonde hair matted with grime and pine needles. A child's hoodie, orange with faded white stripes, clung to thin shoulders. "Lily," Grace called, voice cracking. "Lily, sweetheart, can you hear me?" The girl didn't stir, but just beside her, pressed tightly against her chest, half wrapped in the folds of the hoodie, was a tiny silver tabby, marble. She was awake. The kitten's wide blue eyes blinked slowly at the light, but she didn't move away. Her body rose and fell in shallow rhythm with Lily's. Grace's heart seized. She scrambled forward the last few feet and reached out, brushing back Lily's hair. Her skin was cold but not icy. Grace pressed 2 fingers against her neck, just under the jaw. A pulse, weak but steady. "She's alive," Grace whispered, and she felt her knees tremble. Behind her, she heard scrambling claws on metal. Then Whiskey's head appeared at her side. He whined sharply and began licking Lily's hand with frantic urgency. The girl didn't respond, but the contact seemed to comfort him. He lay down next to her, body pressed into the shaft, tail thudding weakly behind him. "Good boy," Grace said, already reaching for the radio clipped to her belt. Static. Dead air. Of course. She looked back at Lily. They couldn't wait for help. Grace opened her medical kit and pulled out the shock blanket, a small thermal square she wrapped quickly around Lily's upper body. She examined her legs, mud, covered and bruised, but not visibly broken. Marble mewed softly and licked the girl's chin. "I'm going to get us out," Grace said aloud, mostly for herself. She gently maneuvered Lily into her arms, mindful of the cramped space. The girl was dangerously light for her age. Malnourished, dehydrated, but still warm enough that Grace dared hope. It took 10 agonizing minutes to back out of the tunnel with Lily cradled in her arms. Whiskey followed closely, backing out on command, though he clearly hated turning away from the girl. As soon as they emerged into the freezing night air, Grace shouted into the trees, "Help! I have her! I have her!" Silence. Then, a crack of branches. Flashlights. Voices. Officer Riley Grant and 2 rescue volunteers came running from the trail, faces stark with urgency. Grace staggered forward, still holding Lily. She's breathing. She's cold, but she's alive. Relay, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with a strong jaw and steady hands, took the child from her arms with the gentleness of a father. His voice broke when he spoke. "Get the chopper ready." One of the volunteers ran for the clearing. Grace collapsed to her knees. Marble had leapt into Whiskey's side, and the 2 animals now curled together in the snow beside her, silent and steady. Lily was alive, and she hadn't been alone. The fluorescent lights of the county medical center buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile white glow across room 214. Machines beeped in steady rhythm, and IV fluid trickled drop by drop into a small arm, bruised and pale beneath the tape. Wrapped snug in hospital linens, her blonde hair now clean but still tangled at the ends, Lily Chapman lay motionless, save for the rise and fall of her chest. Outside the window, the snow had started, drifting in slow flakes over the hills like a blanket of forgiveness. The storm that had been threatening for days had finally arrived, but Grace felt only warmth as she stood at the foot of the hospital bed. Thomas Chapman, Lily's father, sat in the chair beside his daughter, one hand gripping hers, the other clenched into a fist on his knee. His rugged features were drawn with worry and exhaustion. He hadn't left her side since she'd been airlifted in the night before. In the corner, Grace waited with quiet patience, Marble tucked in a carrier at her feet, and Whiskey lying sprawled on the floor, head between his front paws. A nurse had tried to make Whiskey wait in the hallway, but the moment they'd wheeled Lily into the room, the Labrador had barked on Chess so sharply that even the hospital administrator had stepped back and said, "Let him stay." The door creaked open, and a soft voice followed. She should wake soon. Dr. Hannah Keller, the pediatric physician overseeing Lily's care, was a composed woman in her early 50s, with short brown curls and tired but kind eyes. Years of practicing in rural hospitals had given her a calm that didn't waver, even in emergencies. She adjusted Lily's chart and offered Thomas a small smile. "She's stable. Mild dehydration, a few minor cuts, early signs of exposure, but no infection. She's stronger than she looks." Thomas nodded, eyes never leaving his daughter. Then Lily stirred. It was a twitch at first, just the fingers of her right hand curling. Then her eyelashes fluttered, and her lips parted with a dry breath. Grace felt her own lungs lock, waiting. Whiskey stood, tail slowly beginning to sway, and stepped closer to the bed. Lily's eyes opened, bright, blue, clouded with confusion, then slowly sharpening with recognition as she blinked up at the faces around her. "Hey, sweetheart," Thomas said, his voice a whisper of gravel. "It's okay, you're safe now." Lily looked at him. Her lips trembled. Then she turned her gaze toward Grace, and her expression changed like something deep inside her had clicked into place. Her small voice, hoarse and cracked, pushed through dry lips. "Marble?" Grace crouched down by the carrier and opened the door. The little tabby, as if understanding the cue perfectly, padded out and leapt gently onto the bed. She nudged her nose beneath Lily's chin and curled up on the girl's chest with a tiny purr. Lily smiled for the first time. "I kept her warm," she whispered. "She was so little. She was scared." Thomas closed his eyes, his hand gripping his daughter's tighter. "You saved her," Grace said softly. Lily looked over at Whiskey then, her voice stronger now. "And the dog. I saw him." Thomas glanced toward Grace in confusion. "She hasn't seen him before." "I did," Lily said. "He came to me. When it was dark, when I was cold. In my dreams, he told me to stay awake. Told me Marble was brave too." Whiskey stepped closer, placing his head gently on the edge of the mattress. Lily reached out a weak hand and placed it between his ears. "Is he real?" Grace swallowed. "He's very real. His name is Whiskey." "He's an angel," Lily whispered. "I knew he was." Dr. Keller cleared her throat softly, stepping forward to check Lily's fourth. "We'll need to run some tests later, but she's through the worst." Lily turned her face toward the ceiling. "I didn't cry because of Marble. She needed me." Grace reached for her hand. "And you were there for her, just like she was there for you." A quiet passed over the room. No one dared speak. Then Thomas leaned forward, his face close to hers. "I'm so proud of you, Lily." She blinked. "I was scared you wouldn't find me." He shook his head, tears beginning to well in his eyes. "We never stopped looking. I heard voices outside sometimes, but I couldn't yell loud enough," she murmured. Grace looked toward the window, heart aching at the thought of Lily, buried in darkness, barely clinging to consciousness, relying on a kitten and dream visions of a dog to survive. "But I remembered his face," Lily said, stroking Whiskey's fur. "Even though I never saw it before, I just knew he was mine." Whiskey let out a deep breath and rested his head against her side. "I want to keep him," Lily said quietly. Thomas looked at Grace, eyes wide. "We'll talk about it," he said gently, voice thick with emotion. Grace smiled. "We'll figure it out." And as the snow fell heavier outside, as the storm covered the world in silence, a little girl who had once been lost lay curled in a bed, with a kitten on her chest and a Labrador at her side. Alive. And finally, home. The snow had thickened by midday, blanketing the streets of Ash Hollow in a hushed white silence. Outside the county sheriff's office, wind rattled the flag against its pole, but inside the building, the air was heavier still with tension, with truth long held back, and with the consequences of delay. Cora Dempsey stood in the small wood-paneled interview room on the second floor, wringing her hands in her lap. She wore the same worn mail carrier's coat, though it looked looser on her now, like she'd shrunk in the past week. Her face was drawn and pale, with deep shadows beneath her eyes that made her appear far older than her 53 years. She sat hunched forward, like someone trying to make herself small, still trying to disappear, even now. Across from her sat Detective Riley Grant, a tall man in his mid-40s, with sun-creased skin, graying stubble along his jaw, and eyes that had seen too many people confess too late. He wasn't the kind to yell. He didn't need to. His silence filled the room like judgment. "You came on your own," he said, pen poised above his notepad. Cora nodded. Her voice was a whisper. "I should have come days ago." "Why now?" Her hands twisted tighter. Because I saw the news, saw the little girl's face on the screen again, and then I saw the dog, the one they said found her. She looked up for the first time. That dog, he stared at me. The way he barked the day I brought the kitten. It was like he knew. Riley didn't interrupt. Cora's gaze drifted to the tabletop. I didn't mean to lie, not really. I panicked. I didn't know what to say. Start from the beginning. She closed her eyes. It was last Tuesday. I was doing the evening pickup at the rural mailboxes near the old grain mill Route 9, just off the trailhead. There's a box there that gets missed sometimes, so I stopped. It was getting dark. I got out of the truck and heard something crying, but not loud. Riley leaned forward slightly. And? I looked around and saw them. A man, tall, dark coat, baseball cap pulled low. He was dragging something behind the mill. At first I thought maybe he was a parent with a tantruming kid. But then I saw the child's face. She swallowed. It was her, Lily. She wasn't screaming, just whimpering. And he had her by the arm, hard. Did she see you? I don't think so, Cora said, voice cracking. She looked out of it, like she was too scared to fight. Riley's pen paused. Why didn't you call it in? Cora's eyes welled. Because I was scared. I've reported things before suspicious cars, break-ins, got laughed off. People think I'm the weird mail lady who reads too many crime books. I didn't want to cause a fuss if I was wrong. And what if he saw me? He looked strong, dangerous. Riley kept his voice even. So, you left. Not right away, Cora said quickly. I stayed in the truck, heart pounding. I couldn't move. Then I heard something like metal scraping. And a few minutes later, I heard a sound by the vent near the back of the building. A meow, loud. I got out and followed it. Her hands shook now. That's when I found the kitten, just sitting there near the vent, crying. No collar, dirty, so small. I picked her up and ran back to the truck. Riley nodded slowly. And then you brought her to Dr. Whitaker's clinic. Yes, I didn't know what else to do. I thought maybe, if she saw something, someone would figure it out. You signed the intake form under someone else's name. I panicked, she said again. I used Celia's name. She's the regular for that route. I thought it would keep me out of it. But then Grace asked questions, and the dog, he wouldn't stop staring at me. Her voice dropped. I knew I couldn't hide forever. Riley leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the folder on the desk. You saw the man's face? Not clearly, just the shape of his jaw. Clean shaven, broad shoulders. He wore gloves, even though it wasn't that cold yet. Vehicle? She hesitated. No car that I saw. But I heard tires early off to the North Service Road, near that locked chain gate. Riley scribbled something. Cora's voice softened. I didn't want to be part of something awful. I just wanted to go home, to not be responsible. You are responsible, Riley said quietly, but not unkindly. But now you're helping fix it. Cora pressed a sleeve to her eyes. Do you think she'll be okay? She's awake, Riley said. She asked for the kitten by name. I think she's going to be more than okay. For the first time, Cora let out a breath that almost sounded like relief. Riley stood. You'll stay here a while longer. Fill out a formal statement. We'll need you. Cora nodded. I'll stay. As Riley exited the room, he turned to the deputy waiting by the door. Get a unit to the North Service Road near the mill. We may have a new lead. The confession had come too late to prevent Lily's suffering, but just in time to catch whoever had tried to make her disappear. The morning light stretched softly across the frosted windows of the Whitaker Veterinary Clinic, painting golden rectangles on the linoleum floor. A pot of chamomile tea steeped quietly in the staff room, and the smell of fresh hay and warm fur drifted through the halls. Winter still gripped Ash Hollow, but inside the clinic, something felt decidedly like spring. Grace Whitaker stood behind the counter, signing a final document with calm, practiced strokes. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a loose braid, a smear of cream from Marble's breakfast dotting her sleeve. Across the counter, Deputy Sarah Malin's a woman in her late 30s with a runner's frame, clipped dark blonde hair, and the sharp, alert gaze of someone who'd grown up watching her brothers break the rules offered a grin. "It's official now," Sarah said, sliding the adoption papers into a manila envelope. "Marble belongs to you." Grace looked down where the silver tabby was curled atop Whiskey's back, both animals dozing beneath a shaft of sunlight. "Feels like she belonged the moment she arrived." "She never really left that kid, huh?" Grace shook her head. "Not for a second." Marble had healed fast scabs, disappeared, bruises faded, and her fur now gleamed like brushed metal, but her heart had taken a little longer. For the first few days after Lily's rescue, she barely left the girl's side, even when Lily was too weak to speak. Now that Lily was recovering at home, Marble spent most of her time tucked into Whiskey's side like a shadow with Paws. As if they'd signed a silent pact in that dark tunnel, survive together, heal together. Grace reached down and scratched Whiskey's chin. The Labrador was back to full health. His limp had faded, and the old scar along his haunch had softened into just another patch of gold among gold. But there was something new in him, too, a quiet pride, as if he knew he'd done something that would never be forgotten. The bell above the door chimed. Lily Chapman stepped inside. She wore a navy blue puffer coat, her blonde hair tied up in two lopsided braids, and a knit hat tugged down to her brows. A hint of pink had returned to her cheeks. Behind her was her father, Thomas Chapman, still recovering in his own way less haunted than before, though his eyes still flicked anxiously around like he expected something to be taken from him again. "Hi, Grace," Lily said shyly. Grace smiled. "Right on time as always." Lily set a small cardboard box on the counter. "I made them treats." Whiskey's ears perked. Thomas chuckled. "One for Marble, one for Whiskey, and one extra in case there's a stray outside who needs one." Grace opened the lid and found 3 handmade cookies, shaped like paw prints. "They're beautiful," she said, genuinely moved. "Can you believe Marble's officially ours now?" Lily nodded, her eyes sparkling. "That means she gets to stay here forever, right? And visit you whenever you want." As if on cue, Marble lifted her head and trotted to the edge of the reception bench. Whiskey followed, stretching out beside her with a long, satisfied sigh. Lily dropped to the floor, letting the kitten clamber into her lap while Whiskey rested his chin against her knee. "I missed her," Lily whispered. "She missed you too," Grace said. The room settled into a husha, peaceful kind of stillness, broken only by the sound of Marble's tiny purr and the rhythmic thump of Whiskey's tail. Thomas sat in the corner chair, his shoulders relaxing for the first time all week. Grace leaned on the counter, watching them, a slow warmth building behind her ribs. It wasn't just about adoption papers or clean bandages anymore. This room, this bond, this tangle of soft fur and human hope was what healing looked like. Later that afternoon, Lily curled up on the clinic couch beneath a fleece blanket with a pattern of smiling moons. Marble was nestled against her shoulder, while Whiskey had wedged himself beside the two of them, long body wrapped like a protective crescent. The snow outside thickened against the glass, but inside, it was warm and still. Grace walked by quietly, holding a cup of tea, and paused to look down at them. 3 souls who had wandered through fear and come out the other side not untouched, but unbroken. Lily stirred in her sleep, her fingers brushing Marble's fur. Whiskey shifted only slightly, enough to keep them both within reach. And for the first time in a long time, Grace believed something with her whole heart. Whatever pain had found them in the woods, whatever shadow had tried to take one small girl, and the light she carried it had failed. Because love had teeth, and fur, and claws that refused to let go. Sometimes the smallest voice is the cry of a kitten, the bark of a dog can lead us through the darkest tunnels toward the light. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always come with grand gestures. It often begins in the quiet moments. A warm paw, a soft purr, a child's whispered trust. Love, in its purest form, protects, connects, and redeems, regardless of species or scars. If this story touched your heart, let us know where you're listening from, and maybe share the name of a pet who once helped you heal. We'd love to read your story in the comments below. And if you believe in the quiet magic between humans and animals, don't forget to follow for more true-hearted tales.